Hi, I'm Maria Theoharis for Velosos. You're listening to Soul Organized Style Podcast.
They thought that what we had in terms of digital pattern making was some kind of fancy table that we could put clothing on and it would make a pattern. And of course, that's not how you do it.
That's Claire-Louise Hardie. Let's watch or listen to Claire-Louise now. Claire-Louise, thank you for coming onto the podcast for Sober 50 today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel really thrilled. And I just want to share with everyone that it's now a decade since I met Maria when she kindly organized a meetup in Sydney. And what an amazing decade. And I'm so thrilled that you've asked me to come and join you on your podcast. It's amazing to see everything that you've done in the last 10 years, Maria.
Oh, thank you, Claire-Louise. And I've followed you prior to that 10-year period started, and you've done so much. So should we start with your background and what you've been doing in the last 10 years since we've known each other?
Cool. So I'll just give you a little kind of brief sort of bio, if you like, of
Yeah,
me even before the last 10 years. So
yes.
I am Claire-Louise Hardie. I am the Thrifty Stitcher. That is my business brand. And I'm a professionally trained costumier. So I trained in costume for stage and screen a very long time ago. And originally I started off as a maker. I worked in workrooms and then I became what's called a wardrobe mistress. So as a wardrobe mistress, I've toured the globe. I've been to Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, all the way up and down the UK with companies like the Royal Shakespeare Company, Regent's Park Open Air. I've also worked on some TV and film, and I currently work part-time on a news program called Good Morning Britain as an assistant stylist. So I did end up as part of my sewing journey as the first ever UK sewing producer. So there wasn't a title called sewing producer
No.
on the Great British Sewing Bee. So these are a couple of behind the scenes shots. This was my first book, Fashion with Fabric. I agreed to dress up in the elephant ballerina costume if we raised enough money, and it happened. And I went around London dressed like that. You're all the bee's knees. And then that's the wrap night party of the last series that I worked on. So I did 4 series in total. This is just a little behind the scenes shot of one of my favorite challenges, which was the Mondrian dress. And it was a challenge that I tried for the whole of the time that I was on there to get it in because I just thought it was going to be really impactful. You can also maybe see me with the winner. We were fighting over the medal and a shot of Patrick Grant actually sewing. He was going to a fancy dress and I made him sit and do his own alterations. Prior to like writing this book, I retrained in 2015, so another decade ago. I went off and I did a master's in garment technology and pattern technology at London College of Fashion. And as part of that master's, my collaborative unit was working with the V&A Museum in London to help mount their Balenciaga exhibition, which was super exciting. We got access to archival pieces, and luckily, one of my toiles ended up in the actual exhibition. It's been to Australia and it now forms part of their permanent collection. They thought that what we had in terms of digital pattern making was some kind of fancy table that we could basically put clothing on and it would make a pattern. And of course, that's not how you do it. We still had to do it in quite a labor intensive way. And then what we did was we digitized it and then we looked at some of the elements of couture and whether or not those crossed over into regular fashion. So this was my toile that ended up in the Balenciaga. So this is a little bit of me and a fellow student. We were working on the armhole shape. So this garment, you can see a little bit more in my toile,
Mhm.
has got one seam down the back, well, 2 seams, the shoulders, but the main body has got a single seam. So whatever goes on at the armhole, the swing coming out to the hem is huge. So when I got millimeters of distance wrong here, that had a massive effect on
Yeah.
the garment. So that was my 2 12s for the cape and the dress as part of the permanent exhibition. So these are just a few of the behind the scenes pictures of me in progress. So one of the things that's super important when you are looking at Pattern making from existing clothes is establishing where the grain is. So this was me looking at where the grain might be by creating a horizontal line and then a perpendicular line to it. This is an early toile, and you can see when I was allowed to lay the toile over the original that there were slight discrepancies. Obviously, my fabric was slightly different. So again, that always makes a big difference. This is my finished toile at our final presentation. This is a half scale version of the toile, and I'm showing you these two because in pattern making, you might see some really lovely books called like Pattern Magic or Drape, and
Yep.
those garments are all half scale. So look at how sort of dramatic that shape looks in this half scale, as opposed to the full scale, exactly the same fabric. And that's because the weave of the fabric can't be half scale. So often, what you think you're creating when you're working in half scale and you're going to get a much more floppy looking version when you come into full scale. Just to show you, this is part of the pattern. So this is the center back seam. You can see I've joined lots of bits of paper there to make
Yep.
that kind of work and little adjustments that going on. And this was like such a clever design. And actually, I believe it's Balenciaga that said simplicity is the hardest thing to do. And I was actually a little bit cross that my supervisor for my MA gave me that dress because I wanted something more complex. Do you know what I mean? I wanted the really showy things. But actually, that really kind of floored me with its simplicity. So often, the simplicity is the hardest to achieve. So maybe she knew something I didn't about what I needed on my learning journey. So just have a quick look at that again. This one huge pattern all the way across. So it got cut on the cross grain, which meant that the cross grain ran up and down the front. And
Hmm.
then this was all kind of biased. That would then affect this. And it took me, I think I used maybe 7 meters of fabric for the cape and the dress because that was such a huge piece of cloth. So the Balenciaga is probably, I would say, my biggest cloning project. As a costumer, something that we're often asked to do is to replicate an existing garment. So a designer will find a garment and they'll go, oh, this is perfect. And it's the perfect fit on the actor, etc., etc. But what it isn't is the right color or the right fabric, or it's so delicate that it's not going to survive the run. And so that's where I guess my journey into cloning began.
All of that information that you've just given us about your background, your training, and has been put into Clone Your Clothes. And the book, it's very simple to follow. And from my perspective, I now have a better appreciation for why you've done it in the way that you've done it and how easy it is to use when you want to actually clone clothes.
Oh, thank you, Maria. So, it's one of those things. So, because I've been doing cloning for a really long time,
Yeah.
the publishers actually got in touch with me because they'd seen some content that I'd done about cloning clothes and asked if I'd like to write the book. And because it is something that I've used throughout my professional career, and it is something that I use myself.
Yep.
So, I know when we buy sewing patterns, we've then got to go through the fit. We don't know how the block fits us. If I find something I like, I've delved into middle age where I'm a repeat clothing person now. And if I find something that I like and I can't buy it anymore, so this isn't to steal designs, but let's say the style just isn't sold anymore and I want more of them, then I'm going to take that garment and clone it rather than look for a pattern similar because
Yep.
I'm never going to get exactly the same curves of the hem or exactly the same amount of ease. And what I wanted to do with the book when they asked me to write it was to use cloning as a sort of soft introduction to pattern making. So if you learn pattern drafting, you also have to become a designer. You've got to think up the designs. You also have to learn not just the drafting, but the style up of the pattern, all the creativity. And it feels like a lot. Whereas with cloning, you already know that you love that design because it's
Mm.
there. And
Mm.
so you can use the book and the methods to sort of gain a little bit of pattern making experience without the overwhelm of what do I do with my block? What design do I want? How do I create my block to that design? Because it's there, it's in the garment that you already love.
And the nice thing as well is once you go through the clothing school side of the book and you have a go maybe at the design school part of the book where you've got some really achievable projects, there's
Mhm.
also the template which really pulls together every single part of what you've got in the book that people learn. So it's good reinforcement of all of those elements.
Oh, thank you, Maria. Sounds like you've really studied it hard. Thank you so much. So yeah, part of what I wanted to do is that there are some existing books on cloning your clothes.
Mm,
A lot of them are sort of 30, 40 years old. I think there was one done in the early 2000s. And what I wanted to do was to make it feel like a normal contemporary sewing project book,
mhm,
because otherwise it just feels a little dry. And
mm.
so that's why I came up with the idea of sort of design school, which is the second half of the book, where there are five simple garments that kind of would work together to make a bit of a capsule wardrobe, but also are simple and generic enough that most of us might want one of those in our wardrobe or have one in our wardrobe. So actually, I'm wearing a clone today. So this is the shirt. Okay.
Oh.
And the reason I put a shirt in there is one, it's slightly more unisex. So I wanted people to understand that you could use this techniques, this book, whatever gender clothing you are making, because clothes are clothes. If you don't have this exact shirt, which you're not going to, it's got lots of elements that you could pull out, like a collar. This has got a stand two-part collar. It has a back yoke and it's got a kind of two-part sleeve. And so all of those things are stuff that you could kind of extract and use in your own projects.
And it's interesting that you talked about the shirt because it was probably 7 months ago I decided that I would clone a shirt that my husband had.
Oh,
And all I wanted to do was the two-part collar and add it onto an existing pattern. So
yeah.
I'm glad you've got that one in there. There's a whole lot of stuff that I learned from that process, but now I've got a better idea because I've been going through the book and I've been getting feedback from the other half about what I did and didn't do right for him with the shirt.
Ah,
But but I'm really glad that I did get to do it because
yeah.
I learned that there are a couple of things that you need to just be aware of and try again, not just do it once.
Exactly. And I think, well done for diving in and having a go. And like the collars, I think are, because I know that you're a really proficient seamstress. So collars are one of those scary things that a lot of people think, oh, and actually they're just kind of shapes. Do you know what I mean? So once you've sewn a collar, I think then you'll be able to clone a collar. And you just need to think about where you get started in the process. And that's again what I wanted to do with the book was, I've been teaching this in person for a long time as well as practicing this in
Hmm.
in my kind of professional life. It's been really good because when you write a book or when you teach, you kind of have to systemize things in order for it to make sense. So you have to sort of formalize a process that you could use over and over again, particularly in a book. I find that really useful to think about how could I formalize things that are sort of instinctive for me, including where do you start with each pattern element?
I'll get you to talk us through the three sort of systems, I think I'm going to call them, that you have in cloning school.
I would say before we even think about that,
Yep,
okay, before
yep.
we even think about how we're going to trace it, the first thing we need to do is to think about our grain line. And it all starts and hangs with the grain line. As a sewer, Maria, you get that grain line off, doesn't matter how beautifully you sew it, that's going to go for a little walk. It's going to do some weird stuff. Do you know what I mean? So you really need to be a sort of garment detective and take a little look at your grain line. So, for example, this shirt is fairly easy. The center front button stand, from having sewn in the past, that's nearly always going to be on the grain line. If I fold the back in half and line up the two side seams on top of each other, then the center back where it's on the fold is going to be my grain line. So one of the things that we need to think about when we get started is that grain line is king. Okay, so we
Yep.
want to sort of take a little look at our garments. This is a very simple t-shirt, and you can see it's folded in half, and that center back would then go on the grain. You also then want to think about where the cross grain might be. So if we're looking again at that t-shirt, the cross grain, which gives us that 90 degrees, like I showed you on my Balenciaga,
Yep.
that is where these stripes are. And what you can't see at the bottom of this is that the hem is following a stripe, so I know that it's a straight hem. So that would be like step number one, you look at your grain line. Then step number two, before you start your cloning, and this is the thing, like I'm a super impatient person. I'm always diving in without really thinking. So you just want to sort of draw yourself back a little bit from your excitement and think about analyzing your garment. So analyzing your garment means measuring your button holes, measuring how far the button is from the edge, measuring, the kind of hem, how deep is the hem, how many times has it been folded, and write yourself a little sheet. So I have got a crib sheet that is in the book, but I've got a printable version that I can share with you guys if you'd like it. And then you can use that over and over. So if you've got a copy of the book, you don't need to write in it. So analyzing your garment is super important. Okay, so
Yep.
that would be like your step number two. And then this is just a little bit more about garment analysis. So I like to draw a little diagram, and then on that little diagram, I've written, all the kind of stuff. So this would be a bit like the line drawing that you get. And then you're going to write your own sewing order. Again, I know you guys want to dive straight in, and I'm making you take a little step back, but knowing how you're going to sew it is going to inform as you're looking at your garment as you take the pattern, okay? You're
Yep.
not going to have a set of sewing instructions like you do for a sewing project. So this is the principle that I can share with you guys, and got lots of kind of fun stuff in there. And then you're going to prepare your garment for the actual cloning. So this is a very simple t-shirt. There's no difference in the armhole height, so I could just fold it in half like this. It does mean I've got 4 layers, so that can be a little lumpy. This is a cami top that has got a dart, so I can't just fold it into half with 4 layers. So I'm opening that out like a butterfly. So I'm going to do the front and then the back. And then this is something that's a bit more complex, where an armhole is sewn in to a shoulder and you can't get into this little corner. Then I might lay it singly. And then we're going to look at, this is just a couple of examples of the grain line. I mark this directly onto my garment. So I
Yep.
folded the trousers in half and I put a little crease, or I measured, drew a line up from the hem, and then I've got that perpendicular grain line. Like I said, the shirt's a little easier, and the cami top, you're going to have to kind of look a little bit at the grain and see
Mm.
that on the garment. It's normally kind of in line with where the bust area is, but see where it doesn't stretch. So you are being grain line detectives here. And then we have got which methods we're going to use. So I've
Yes.
given you a little chart of what kind of methods you might want to use, okay? And this, again, I will share some of these slides with Maria if that's helpful for you guys. But there are 3 methods. Direct measuring, which is kind of what you think of. We're going to take a tape measure and we're going to measure it. Tracing, this involves pinning it to some kind of a board or anchoring it with pattern weights onto paper, and then tracing around the perimeter, and then using a tracing wheel and the places that we can't actually trace the perimeter. And then overdraping, which is kind of using a piece of fabric over the top. And this is really useful for complicated things like a waterfall drape or pleats, asymmetric details, something where it would be very hard to try and get it flat and
Mm.
trace it out. And in America, they call that method the rub-off method. So I'm just going to say that. I'm British, and in Britain, that makes us smile a little because it can be kind of a little funny term. So I'm just getting that out there, guys, because, so that is the 3 main methods. So if we come back and take a little look at the chart, The examples of overdraping, for example, might be a ruched panel or a molded garment where you couldn't actually get it all flat on the table, waterfall drapes. Tracing is the one that I use most commonly, and that would be like a sleeveless t-shirt or a raglan or culotte. So I use that the most. And then direct measuring a gathered skirt or a circle skirt or a sheared dress or a gathered frill or a
Mm.
detail like a strap or a cuff. There's no point trying to lay that all out because it's going to get distorted. Okay. And then this would be literally direct measuring. Okay. So I've
Yeah.
got a waistband and I'm stretching it with my tape measure and I'm measuring how wide that is. Okay. And that is then times two, and that becomes the length of your waistband pattern. And then I'm also measuring how high it is. And then again, that's times two because it folds over.
Yeah.
And that would be the height or the width of your waistband. And then you add seam allowance all the way around. So you don't work with the seam allowance when you're making your pattern. Um, any questions on the direct measuring? Have you done simple stuff like that, Maria? Like
I have.
just making a quick skirt?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's usually just replacing a waistband on something that I love.
And I
And
think also it's useful for, let's say you're making something and you don't like the waistband, you can think about
yeah.
but you like the waistband on something else. You could copy it and then just do a bit of mathing to make sure that the edge is neat. Okay. And then we've got tracing. So this is the method that I use the most. And you can see here, I've given you an example of how to prepare the paper. So as someone who's been pattern making for a long time, it's always really annoyed me that they haven't told you how big of a piece of paper to start with. And
Hmm.
so I've given you a rough idea based on the garments that I use. So you can see I have the center front grain line, which correlates with this. I've got a cross grain here. And the reason that's important is it stops your garment sort of going for a
Yeah.
walk on the paper as
Yeah.
you are tracing. And then I've got another balancing line, the hemline, where I use that sort of like as my anchor point. And in tracing, we are then going to use a pencil to mark the perimeter wherever you can, and then you are also going to use a tracing wheel. And the one that you want to use is the needlepoint one, not the serrated one. So the serrated one might not go through the fabric. So if it's a super delicate fabric, instead of using the tracing wheel, which can
Mm.
snag, you can go along with pins and just kind of wiggle them in. So I do like to use a padded surface, but
Yeah.
just sort of a pin and a bit of a wiggle will give you a hole, or you can put a row of pins all the way along that seam line that you're tracing inside of the garment.
Yeah.
So tracing is like my favorite method, and it's quick and it's easy. And then we're going to take a look at the third method, which is overdraping. So this is the one that I say I use the least. Can you see I have a layer of muslin over
Yeah.
this pleated skirt, and then I've measured all the pleats and I'm actually pleating on top of where the pleats are in order to
Hmm.
create this shape. You don't need a mannequin to do that kind of draping, but where those pleats are, I've kind of padded them to give them the length and the roundness that the pleat needs, because when it's flat, sometimes you'd lose that and you wouldn't make it quite so long. So I think that's the method that people find the most scary, maybe. Have you had a go at doing that, Maria?
I've had a go at a skirt that had the pleating because I was trying to replicate something that had a Scottish feel because it was tartan.
But again, like it's just a bit of cloth laid over your garment, just play with it. So again, if you've never made an asymmetric pleated skirt, then maybe cloning that isn't the right cloning project for you. But if you understand how pleats work, you can kind of replicate that. And sometimes I might just drape a little detail like that and then trace the rest of the pattern. So I'm not using lots and lots of fabric. So you can mix and match the three different techniques. There are other techniques, obviously, in sewing. There's like always millions of ways to do everything, right?
Yeah.
But these are the three that I kind of think are the most useful. And so I distilled the book down into those three methods.
Great. And the thing is that once you've had a go at one or two projects, you might use part of a different of either of those techniques so that you can get a really good outcome.
Exactly. And so in the cloning school half of the book, so that was sort of like the teaching end, if you like, teaching and
Mm.
introducing the skills. Then, I've used specific examples, some of which were the projects in the book, but some of which were slightly other things like that gathered rough on a vest top and things. And then the projects I've then maybe expanded. So in the cloning school, I've shown you how to trace one type of dart, but as we know, there's lots of types of darts. And then in the Cami project, which comes later in the book in design school, it's a different dart. So you've got two different examples of how you might do that. And then later on in the tea dress, it's another type of dart. So again, you've got three different ways to trace a dart within the book.
I think the fact that you've given us a few different examples helps us who are shapely or not shapely come up with the clone of something that suits you really well.
Exactly. And I think what I wanted to do was rather than just doing it by technique, because I did look at how I would present all the kind of information and the teachings,
Mhm.
rather than it being technique by technique, and I'm going to give you a chapter on darts, and then I'm going to show you five or six, and it doesn't feel real. I think we need to have a go in real life. So actually cloning your own cami, which is then teaching you method number two for darts, is a better way personally to learn than just having a section which is like six ways to clone a dart.
Mm.
I
Mm.
don't know. Hopefully that was the right choice.
Like I said, I've been through the book. I found it very easy to have a look and give myself some confidence that maybe what I have been doing worked, but there are a few other things that I can learn, which I'm really pleased you've got them all in the book now.
Ah, thank you, Maria. I think that's the thing is that if you can sew,
Mm.
we've probably all had a go at sort of replicating something or cloning something. And I
Yep.
think within all of us is that slight imposter feeling that we feel, oh, maybe I'm not doing it right or I'm not good enough and I just wanted it to be like, here's some sort of like basic foundations just to give you a little bit of hand holding. Yes, you have been doing it all right. And then maybe these are some other tips that might make it easier. That was how I wanted it presented.
And the template at the end really does bring all the elements together so that and that's what I found. That was my experience when I went through the book, is that
Ah,
it was a really useful template and it really showed me that, if I've skimmed something, I can actually go back to that area and have another go when I'm ready to try it again on another project.
there's obviously like a little bit of learning. So I'm just going to share another little slide with you. So once you've done all your tracing, you've then got a few more steps,
Yep.
like there's no seam allowance. So you've got to add your own. So that's where the pattern drafting skills come in, the pattern making.
Mm.
But instead of you having to have drafted it from scratch, you're just kind of creating your pattern a slightly easier way, I think. For example, these are some things you might need to think about when you are
Yeah.
cloning
Yep.
is you want to true up scenes, make sure that they match. And then once you've done all of that, you are going to add your seam allowance. So I've given you a couple of examples for how you would add in seam allowance. And then once you've done all of that, you can then finish your pattern. So this is the example of the cami, and
Yep.
you're going to label everything. So you're going to make it look like your sewing patterns. You want to put a place to fold, you want to put a grain line, you want to put how much the seam allowance is, and then you want to put the pattern numbers. So you probably know this, Maria, but do you know how the numbers on pattern pieces work?
I don't.
Okay, so back in the vintage day, before we had lots of printing, we
Yep.
only had kind of holes and stuff cut out.
Mm-hmm.
So numbers were really important. So the numbers relate to where you start sewing. So you start with piece number one, and piece number two is the second piece to get joined to it. And then piece number three is going to be joined to those two. So often that's why the numbers for faces and things are quite big, because, for example, with my cami, I can't join the strap until piece number one has been joined to piece number two, and
Right.
I can't put a facing on until piece number one has been joined and the straps have been joined. So if we did have a facing, that would be piece number five. Just a little bit of fun facts about how patterns are numbered. I learned that like when I started teaching sewing, I learned that somewhere and I was like, wow, just makes so much sense, but you just don't know, do you? Like,
No, no. And I'm glad you brought it up because maybe it had been mentioned to me at some point, but it's just gone straight out.
but I think it's not so relevant these days because
Mm.
we're following more detailed instructions. We're not, vintage patterns relied very much on you knowing how to do it. So it would
Mm.
be make up the shell. But now it would say join piece number one to piece number two. So
Yep.
patterns have evolved, haven't they?
If people have had a go at cloning their clothes from the book and they still need some advice or they would like to get more one-on-one with you, what's the best way for
Yeah.
people to get in contact with you?
Mostly I'm on Instagram as Thrifty Stitcher, so that's like my brand name. I do run an online sewing membership called Elevate Your Sewing, which is a hybrid of a bit of live training, which then I record and that gets edited and it goes into a library. So there's a very big library and it's slightly unusual membership, I think, in that I wanted to teach skills rather than projects because
Yep.
if I pick a skirt project, I can guarantee that only maybe 10% of my members are going to like that project. And so the rest of them are going to feel a bit less left out. And so rather than it being based on things they had to buy and patterns and all that kind of stuff, it's more about skills. So we've got a whole section on pattern hacking and creative pattern work, and we've got a few courses on cloning. So there's some mini courses in there, and then things like how to sew in as very specific, how to sew a lap zip in. So there's just a little video on that. So you could then apply that to the project you're working on. So that's where I do most of my teaching. If you happen to be in the UK, I do also run sewing retreats, but we're sold out for 2025. And if you're a total beginner, I've got some online beginners courses, but I think anyone who is following Maria isn't going to be a total beginner because she's so skillful that I think all of your followers are also skillful.
Thank you, Claire Louise. I appreciate that. But it's really great that you've given us all the various ways to get more information from you, to learn from you, and to maybe one day go to one of your sewing retreats as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one day I'll run one in Australia. That's the dream. I'm trying to work out a way to do it. So I'm just going to say one other thing. If you bought the
Yep.
book, there are inside the book a whole load of these. So this is a QR code,
Mhm.
and this QR code will take you to a website. It's behind a paywall. You need to provide your email, but there's no cost to this, and there are actually other stuff. And what we've done is we've created this page inside there where you can find all these little videos that I've made. So there's a little introduction, like to the concept of the book. And then I've got a little very short, it's no longer than like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, how to trace video. And then I've got one on how to fold your garment. And then I've got one on how to walk your seam. So these are the more technical things. So those things that you might struggle with when you're looking at a book. So I think there's 13 little videos. And those are sort of like a way of giving you a little bit extra because I know when you buy a book, if there's something you're struggling with, and I looked through all the things that I thought would be trickiest and decided that having a little bit of video content might support that. So that's another way that you can sort of get my helping hand in a slightly different way, I guess.
Honestly, Claire Louise, that's better than just a book because you've got the videos as well. That's
Ah,
fabulous.
thank you. These days with books, we're all becoming more digital. And so I wanted to think of a way that the book would have longevity. These days, we want a little bit more than just a book, don't we? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's
true.
kind of, mixed media, having some kind of video content as well.
So, Claire Louise, the book is not just a book, but it's got the project template available, and you've got the videos as well that people can have a look at, which is it's the book, but it's got so much more.
Yeah, and for your viewers, I've got a special video that I'll share with you that's actually just a bonus video that I made, which is showing you step-by-step garment analysis. So it's talking through it using a few different examples, and I'll send you the link to that to share.
Oh, thank you so much, Claire-Louise. That's really generous of you.
Well, I think it's just because it was, it was a real passion project and
Mm.
it's kind of nearly a year's worth of work. And so I wanted to kind of really think about how I could support people after they'd bought the book too.
So all of this really, I mean, you had the amazing experience at the V&A with the Balenciaga cloning. I can't even
Yeah.
say that because, like, you just did a fabulous job. And now we've got the benefit of all of your experience in this one book, which is more than just a book.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I'm really proud of the work and it's great because it's sort of like when you've been teaching something, a topic for a long time, it's nice to kind of go, oh, I've just put it all together. So if anyone ever asks me for help, I can say, here you go. It's my book.
Claire Louise, thank you for coming on to the podcast for Sober 50. It's been wonderful knowing you for a decade, but even more wonderful
Oh,
that we've been able to talk as well.
yeah, and thank you so much, Maria, not only for asking me to come on to your podcast, which is such an honor, but for a decade's worth of friendship, because you've always been such a supportive friend and you've always made time for me when I visited the other side of the world. And I know how tricky that is when someone comes to your city and you've got like schedules and stuff. And I've always really appreciated being able to spend time with you. Hopefully, I'll come to Sydney on my next trip.
Anytime, you're always welcome.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Maria.
Thanks, Claire Louise. All the images Claire Louise refers to in this podcast are available both on the podcast website and also you can watch it on the YouTube version of this podcast. This episode of Soul Organized Style Podcast for Sober 50 was video and audio produced by me, Maria Theoharis, in my sewing room with permission of Claire-Louise Hardie, sound by Knife on YouTube. Not a podcast patron contributor yet. For the cost of a coffee, you can help me continue to create these video and audio podcasts for free. Subscribe to Soul Organized Style Podcast, spelled with an S, not a Z, on all good podcast apps and on YouTube. Direct message Sandy and the editors at Sober50 on Instagram to contribute to the ongoing posts and challenges. I look forward to joining you in your sewing room next time. Stay safe, everyone.